Right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to our third lunchtime webinar. And today our webinar is being presented by Raja Mita. And it's talking about building a business strategy and talking about things like value proposition. And it really is a great pleasure to invite Raja to provide this webinar for us, because Raja is a really good friend of the Smart Network. And we really appreciate the fact that he's been able to spare the time to talk to us today, because I know how busy he is. But also, first and foremost, congratulations, Raja, on being elected one of Edmonton's top 40 under 40 this week. So that is totally awesome and well deserved. So congratulations, applause, everybody. That's fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Martin. Thank you so much.
And that's a message from all of us at the Smart Network. We really wanted
thank you so much.
Say highly deserved and fantastic. Also, just a very brief bio, Raja, and if we've missed anything, please fill in. But you've really been a sort of cross-sectorial person in the healthcare area for about 10 years. And your role is, at the moment, the lead for health innovation at Alberta Innovates. So a lot of the proposals we write and a lot of the interactions we have with Alberta Innovates find their way in one way or other to Raja. And Raja's really been instrumental in helping startups, large industry, academia, and health delivery agents to really accelerate the integration of emerging digital and data-enabled technologies into new models of care to achieve both economic and health outcomes for Alberta. And so he's also an instructor at MacEwan University School of Business, where he delivers undergraduate courses in business consulting, strategy, and innovation. So we're going to be really gaining a tremendous insight from both Raja's role in enabling innovation in Alberta, but also how he instructs and influences our up-and-coming business students in Alberta as well. So Raja, over to you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Martin. Sorry, my lights just went out here. I had to come to the office because I have some family in from out of town, and there's no way I could have had enough quiet to do this at home. But I'm gonna share my screen. I think I tried to already. Did my screen come up?
Yes, it did. It came up briefly and then went away again.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was showing.
Do you have any audio as well, Raja, or is it just plain slides?
No, just slides.
Okay, that's great. Nice and easy.
Can you see my slides?
No, not at the moment.
Bear with me. You did see them though, you said.
Yeah, briefly we saw them, yeah, for about 20 seconds.
This is always the most embarrassing part.
Don't worry about it.
To figure out how to do that.
We've all been through it many times. Are you using the share screen, right?
I am, but what I'm finding hard to do is sharing the PowerPoint screen rather than like the PowerPoint is running rather than okay, screen 2. I think I got it.
Yep. No, that's just your desktop, but you're getting there.
I'm getting there. Damn it. I have 3 monitors, so something's not working here. Something's not. I apologize to everybody here. I promise you, we're gonna figure this out quick. Move that one.
There we go. That looks more promising.
Does that look? You can see something.
Yeah, if you can maximize it, that would be great. But we can certainly see it. Just put it in presenter mode if you can.
Is it in presenter mode now?
Oh no! When you went to presenter mode, that's what messed it up.
That's what keeps happening.
Yeah. Oh well, it's very readable out of presenter mode if you want to avoid that.
How about now?
Still your desktop.
Yeah. So
there it is.
There you go.
There it
is.
Yep.
Yeah. Everything.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Let's kind of reset here. Thank you so much, Martin. I do appreciate that wonderful introduction. I'm lucky to be here. I'm privileged to be here. I've gotten to know you and the Smart Network team, I think, quite well over the last few years. And I know that this is one component of the entrepreneurship activities that you guys engage in this ecosystem. And I'm really happy to have an opportunity to contribute as much as I can. So I know a lot of what you've already heard in this workshop previously has come from some very smart, very experienced individuals. I know this morning, some of my favorite people, Fareed, Paramita, Michael, Kurian, who's a master in marketing, have really kind of shared with you components already around how to start to think about how to build a business strategy. And I might repeat some things that you've already heard in a different way, from a different lens. And I just want to say, I think that that's okay. It never hurts to hear them again. There's no one way to do this. I've seen many frameworks. I've seen many workshops. I've seen many technologies. And really what I wanted to do today was try to bind all that together, because I do think there's one commonality between them all. And that's everything that you're doing, whether I tell you what that is, or whether Martin does, or Kurian or Paramita, it's all just a hypothesis until a customer buys something from you. And so I want to walk you through that a little bit today, and what I think that looks like, and what I think you need to think about today. So I'm going to try to get you into the mindset of being a business rather than being an entrepreneur or being a graduate student. I want to remind you again that everything you're developing is a hypothesis that needs testing, and we'll walk through what I mean by that. And of course, many of you, if not all of you, are graduate students, so you're acutely aware of what a hypothesis is. And a hypothesis needs to be tested. And so again, I'll kind of share that with you and try to drive that home in different ways. And I'll provide some simple frameworks that you can use to get started into developing that business strategy. Of course, you've seen the lean canvas, you've probably seen some other things. I'm going to really get really simple around maybe how to attack some of those pieces in that lean canvas. Now, Martin, I'm not sure how this is set up. I don't know if you just want me to speak. I am open if folks want to interrupt and ask questions. There's probably more about building a business strategy not in this lecture than there is in it. And so if somebody has a question, we can veer off for a bit. I will bring it back if we need, but I'm not sure really how this is run and how the Zoom stuff is being set up, Martin. Can you let me know before we get started?
So we have chat open for folks to type into, and also if you'd like, we can do a formal use the Q&A feature, but just for now, chat is open for people.
Yeah, if we use chat, I will monitor the chat, Raja, and then if there's something that really ought to be, to interrupt you, on a key point, I would just jump in. But on the whole, what we found is people have kind of accumulated the questions towards the end.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll do that then. So, what is a business strategy? You guys probably asking yourselves this all the time. If you go on the Indigo website, there's over 8,000 books on building a business strategy. If you Google it, there are 167 million plus results, and there's tons of YouTube videos. So where do you start? What do you do? And really, all of those books, all of those videos, all of those definitions, to me, boil down to one thing. So it's a clear set of actions that helps you compete in a very specific market. And there's one goal and one goal only. And I know that's oversimplifying it, but I'm going to be super simple today, because taking a innovation to market is super complex. And you're hearing from lots of smart people in this workshop that are going to help you with the complexity. So I'm going to try to be a little simple today. So number one goal, acquiring customers. So I want to try to shift a little bit of the mindset here, and you're probably already shifting this mindset away from product features towards customer value. So yeah, your tech does A, B, and C, and it allows folks to do things in new ways. But that doesn't mean and doesn't necessarily equate to what your customer sees as valuable. So we're going to try to make that shift today. We're going to start talking about market forces rather than startup forces. And we're going to talk about the most important thing, and that's really moving from dilutive capital, or in some cases, non-dilutive capital, such as grants. But we really want to start to talk about revenue, because a business strategy that doesn't get you to revenue is not a good business strategy. Eric Schmidt is one of my favorite quotes of all time, mostly because it's really untrue in almost every case. But when you're a small company, it's really, really true, and that's revenue solves all known problems. And for those that don't know, Eric Schmidt was CEO at Google for the early years in the early 2000s. So when you're building a business strategy, I really like to, and you'll hear me use this interchangeably, is really what we're doing is we're building a business strategy hypothesis. And you're going to take that hypothesis and you're going to engage with customers. Simultaneously, you'll build a minimum viable product, and then you'll actually have a business strategy plan that will probably work. One of the biggest mistakes, or one of the largest errors, and really an error that requires a lot of backpedaling, a lot of extra investment, a lot of extra time that we see entrepreneurs do, is they start to build a minimum viable product, and then they try to develop a business strategy plan. And I'm sure that many folks already throughout this workshop have warned you to not do this, to do it simultaneously, or to start with your hypothesis, do some customer discovery, and then move into these two phases. And really, that's what I'm going to focus on today, is those pieces of your hypothesis and then how we can test them. I'm a big fan of Dilbert. As I said, I do instruct at MacEwan University, and I use all these Dilbert cartoons. And it's starting to remind me that I am getting older, because most of the students I engage with don't know who Dilbert is. It's an amazing set of cartoons based on business. And a lot of it really resonates with everything that you'll learn from marketing to finance to product development. And here I just wanted to show this here. This is Dilbert, he's the main character, talking about how he added all the product features. And now it's this worthless hodgepodge of complexity. And he says, I appreciate your input. I couldn't have failed without you. So your product is going to have lots of pieces to it, but really, what are the pieces that matter? So in your business strategy hypothesis, I'm going to talk a little bit about market. I'm going to talk a little bit about the innovation type. I'm talking about value props and competitive advantage, less about competitive advantage, because the lean canvas, I think, does a really good job with that. And I believe Kareem went through that. And then we'll talk, and we'll end this, and we'll chat a little bit about customer discovery. And I'll try to equate all of these things to why it's important to consider them when developing that business strategy, the risks that are associated with all of these things, and how you need to consider these to move forward with what you're doing. So there's, and again, being very simple and using from some very simple frameworks. And I want to reiterate, this is not the only way to do this. So you need to ask yourself, what kind of market are you? And there's, again, probably a way to segment types of market in 5 or 6 different ways, 10 different markets. We're going to go with these 4. So are you in a clone market? Is there an opportunity, and does your innovation just allow you to capture some extra demand because there's no supply? Example of this, a really good example in the health space, was masks during the peak of the pandemic. The demand side was so huge, and the supply side couldn't keep up. And as an innovator and as someone who's trying to launch a business, it was actually quite easy if you get your hands on some supply to create customers in this market. Competition is really low in this market because the demand can't be met. And the risk is pretty low because the demand can't be met. There's also a resegmented existing market. Maybe that's where you're at. It's an opportunity to capture market through competition. You're faster, you're cheaper, you're better. A good example of this, not in the health sector, but it's happening a lot right now in the automobile sector. Hyundai just launched a cheaper luxury SUV brand called the Palisade. It's a lovely vehicle, but the competition still is high, and the risk is medium because you're trying to convince folks that your product that you're selling for less, because it may be cheaper in some ways, is equivalent in this particular sector. You might also be doing a resegmented niche. So there's an opportunity to capture market share through a special offering. An example is the dating industry. So there are a number of websites. I just picked one, Millionaire Love, which is a dating site for the wealthy. And essentially it's trying to carve off a niche of this very large market in a different way. Competition is low. The risk is medium because the market already exists. And then there's also potential for a new market. And these are rare. And again, I'm not familiar with what you guys are developing as part of this workshop, but this is an opportunity to create a market that didn't exist before. And the best example that I've ever heard, and a lot of people use it, and maybe you've already heard it, is when Henry Ford built the car and folks asked him, and he said, if I asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, and we never would have got an automobile. And so there was no market for automobiles, there was no competition, but the risk was high because there was no standards, there was no understanding of whether folks wanted this, and there was no way really to get them. Why does it matter? So when you're thinking about your business strategy and how to get to market, why does the market type matter? Well, it matters because the market size can be different. The cost of entry, competitive barriers, and the sales cycles, those all change depending on where you're heading and depending on what type of market you're trying to get into. Customers change, so their needs, their adoption barriers, and financing changes. So it's much harder to get money or raise money sometimes for a market that doesn't exist than it is for a market that does. And time to profitability can be much more extended the newer the market is and the higher that risk is. So really something to kind of think about. When you're thinking about what market you're in, and I do encourage you to do that, you should think about it and just ask yourself some questions. You know, is there room on the supply side? Can I create barriers to entry? If you're going into a clone market, you have to be aware that at some point supply may catch up to demand, and you want to try to create some barrier for others to get in before that actually happens. If you're in a resegmented existing market, and actually this is where we see a lot of entrepreneurship and a lot of activity, is folks trying to create something better. Well, how will you do that? And is what you're doing to create that better product easily replicable? And you guys probably went over the unique competitive advantage or unique sustainable competitive advantage that you may have, or you may be trying to develop in past components of this workshop. That's really, really important. If you can't do that, at some point you should expect somebody to overtake you. If it's a resegmented niche market, you got to ask where will your customers come from and why do they care about this niche? That's really important. And in a new market, you really have to ask the most important question is, how do you attract early adopters? Because that's not always easy. So you're not going to do this with me, but something that you can think about on the side is really what type of market are you proposing to enter? What are some of the risks associated with that? And what is your market hypothesis really based on? And how can you start to test that? One of the other things that you probably have also went over by this point is your market size. And you've probably spoken about the TAM, the SAM, the SOM, available market, serviceable available market, serviceable obtainable market. And just in case you haven't, I'll quickly reiterate that total available market is really everything that is out there. You're developing a technology that'll support patients with high blood pressure. You could say, well, this is the blood pressure market, it's $2 billion. But really, your technology doesn't apply to everybody in that market and to every component of that market. It only applies to folks that are interested in testing their own blood pressure at home. That's your serviceable market. And then your serviceable obtainable market are those folks that may have high blood pressure and are overly concerned about it and are in a certain geographical location, and that's your serviceable obtainable market. And so you really start to focus this down. I always like to think there's an even more granular way to think about this. I do think that there's an ideal customer that you do need to think about. One of the hardest things that you can ask an entrepreneur to do is to really hone in and focus on this ideal customer. Remember, the whole reason you're launching a business is to sell something to a customer. And that ideal customer is even going to be smaller than your serviceable obtainable market. It's going to be a component of that. But I always tell folks, and it's hard, to put all your eggs in this basket. And the reason why that's so hard is, of course, you're really limiting and you're creating a bunch of risk for yourself by focusing in. And your product has so much to offer to so many other people and to so many other potential customers. But really, I think you got to hone in on this ideal customer, and I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. And until you get that sale from that very, very small circle of ideal customers, you should really be careful with trying to be too broad with what your offering is. So I want to talk about market segmentation of that ideal customer. And really, again, these are things that if you take any marketing class, and I'll bet you Kurian did go over a little bit of this, is just a way to find that ideal customer, not your market, your customer, and where they live. And we tend to think of these things, I just ripped these off of the internet, but you'll find that almost every single framework really tries to segment that customer into using 4 different components, and that's really geographical. And to get really, really specific, and you'll see this is really specific, it talks about zip codes, time zones, population density, dominant language. You know, it almost seems crazy to think that granular before your technology is ready. But you need to think that granular because you're going to have to talk to these customers before your technology is ready. Same thing from a demographic perspective. Same thing from a psychographic perspective. That's the one that folks often forget in terms of your values, their values, their goals, their needs. And then behavioral. How do they buy? How do they like to interact with brands? How do they spend? And what is their loyalty like? And really the benefits of this, it helps determine your market opportunities. It lets you tailor make some marketing initiatives. And really it gets you niche into what that looks like. Talks about product development design, and it helps with determining pricing. And so I'll just walk you through, again, a bit of how you could do this and how you could drive down and down and down to try to understand what that customer looks like. This is just an example I just put up. It's hypothetical. It's a company that might be in healthcare. That's a very broad type of industry. But of course, within that industry, there's subsectors: acute, primary, ambulatory, community. Within those subsectors, there's public, private, nonprofit. Maybe it's selling something to consumer direct. There's jurisdictions to think about. There's size to think about. And you can continue to do this over and over and over and over and just segment over and over and over and over again. And that'll again help you develop that ideal customer and what that hypothesis looks like. So I would suggest trying that. I know the lean canvas talks about your market, but I would really start to think about your ideal customer and really kind of bring that down to a person and what type of person is going to buy this for you. So I want to talk about the innovation type, and we'll talk about why that is important and how that relates to your business strategy and some of the risk. This is one of my favorite quotes of all time. It's from Jeff Nicholson. You guys have all used Post-it notes, I'm sure. He's considered the father of the Post-it note. And the Post-it note, for those that don't know, was created. They're actually trying to create a super glue, and they created a glue that was a really not a great glue. And they spent 5 years trying to figure out what are they going to do with this not so great glue. And they made Post-its. But he said, turning money into knowledge is research. And that is what most of your training to this point as a graduate student has been about: getting grants and turning that money into knowledge. That's research. But turning knowledge into money is innovation. And so keep thinking with that lens and with that frame of mind is how you're going to turn that knowledge into money. So there's different innovation types, and most folks that we see at Alberta Innovates and most folks in healthcare start with this technology innovation thinking: new materials, new processes, new applications. Very simple example is, again, home blood pressure monitor. But there's also market innovation. So this is like business model innovation, market arbitrage, capturing something that has changed from a regulatory compliance, or capturing something that's happened in the market. A good example of this is once COVID hit and it was really difficult to get out and get a haircut, some folks launched a business called Doorbell Barbers. And essentially, very simply, the barber comes to you. And that's a business model innovation. It captured a market where folks were looking for a little bit more convenience, and also there were restrictions about going out and about interacting, and they would just give you a haircut on your driveway. It could be both. And a really good example is Uber. So they have technology, they have algorithms, they have market innovation. So they've allowed folks with assets to realize some additional value through those assets. You're using your car every day to drop your kids off, to go to school, to go shopping. Now, well, they've allowed you a way to utilize that asset to generate revenue for yourself. And they also created a bit of quality assurance around this through reviews. You get to review the driver gets to review you. And that originally had never existed in the rideshare market. What does this mean? Well, depending on whether it's market innovation or a technology innovation, we're really looking at risk. And so something like the Doorbell Barbers is high market innovation. The home blood pressure monitor is high tech innovation, and Uber is both. So you'll see it here in the upper right-hand corner. And what's important to note is that is the highest risk quadrant, if you put this in a 2x2, and if your technology or your innovation is in the space, you're going to really need to think about regulatory compliance, adoption barriers, switching costs, passing the baton on risk. So, you know, Uber did pass the risk on to the drivers in a lot of ways. But on the flip side of that is it's the highest reward. So doorbell barbers, you know, it's small but meaningful potatoes is what I like to call it. It's a good family business, can make some money, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, maybe. Home blood pressure monitor, maybe millions a year. But Uber is worth $80 billion. And one thing to note in the health innovation space is there are very, very few health innovations that we're seeing that don't have a market innovation component. And what I mean by that is a lot of the technology that's being developed is changing the way patients are being cared for. And so one thing that we'll talk about in a few slides, and one thing to always consider, is how does your technology change those models of care? How does it integrate into those models of care? And what are the risks associated with changing those models of care? And probably the biggest risk from a health innovation perspective are adoption risks, implementation risks, and just switching risks. So innovation in healthcare, in my experience, when you say that in a clinical setting, you might as well be saying risk. And there's always a level of risk that needs to be considered by clinicians whose first and most important role is to care for patients. And so when they hear innovation, you really have to start to think about how your technological innovation is going to change the model of care and how we're going to mitigate some of that risk. And we'll talk about value propositions and how it's important in healthcare to really make sure that the value propositions are positioned for different individuals within those models of care and within the healthcare industry. Just doing a time check. So really think about what type of innovation you're developing. And I would strongly suggest that you think about what some of the risks are that you will be facing. So I mentioned a few of them, but how will you mitigate those risks? And part of risk mitigation is a strong part of a good business strategy. So let's talk about value props and competitive advantage. And I'll start by saying this, and there are probably folks that might disagree with it, but I like to think of them as being separate and different things that are not always the same. And I'll just explain what I mean by that. So I'm going to say value proposition and competitive advantage are not always the same. And I'll give you the example of Google. Oh, let me talk about this first. So to me, a value proposition is all about the customer, and your competitive advantage is all about the market. So value proposition is what's in it for your customer. Your competitive advantage is how do you protect your business within a very competitive market. The value proposition should be unique, but that's not essential. Your competitive advantage should be unique, and it is essential. If you don't have a unique, sustainable competitive advantage, somebody will replicate what you're doing, and your business will be at risk. And value proposition is used for positioning, and I'm quite certain I've actually went to a few workshops put on by Kurian himself, and I'm sure he's spoken about positioning with you guys. But competitive advantage is also used for positioning. I won't talk about positioning today, because I'm sure that most of you have developed positioning statements, or are working on developing position statements, and it's a really significant part of the lean business canvas. So I'll give you an example of Google and how they're different. So from a competitive perspective, I don't know this, but people say it, and you probably have experienced it based on how you're searching, but they have top tier search algorithms. results. That's a technology thing. That's a competitive advantage that folks in this industry that are trying to launch similar search engines have to compete with. They do have the most users. This adds to their data. It helps create better algos. And they've managed to turn good algos into more users, into better algos, into more users. They have the largest index on the internet. As a customer, I actually don't care about any of these things. They're good for Google because it allows them to position themselves and to make sure that they can't be overtaken in this industry. But what I care about as a client, as a customer, is I care about accurate results. I care that it's fast, and I love that it predicts what I want, right? We all know that as you're putting things into Google and you're searching, it's predicting what you're looking for. And I think as a customer, these are the things that we really care about. And it's easy to use. So the customer cares. To me, that's a value proposition. Competitive advantage, I don't care as a customer. You know, maybe if we dig deeper on this, maybe I care because I don't want Google to go anywhere. But really, if somebody can do better than them, I don't care. So really, your value proposition is about what the customer cares about. So I won't talk about the competitive advantage piece. You're probably doing a lot of that. You're probably thinking about how to get some IP to protect what you're doing. You're probably thinking about what's unique about your product or service. You're probably thinking about how you develop some barrier to retain your positioning in the market. So I won't go through that today. But I do want to talk about value proposition. And I'm going to just use a very simple framework that is useful across any industry. In health, sometimes we use who tries, who buys, who uses, who chooses, because those can be 4 different individuals in health. But to kind of get us started, I wanted to just provide a very simple framework that really lets you think about it, no matter what industry your innovation is going to be in. So when you're developing value propositions, and I say propositions, there's an S at the end of that, you really have to think about who it's for. And if you're trying to sell into healthcare or finance or even your hair salon down the street, you have to think about the different buyers. There's usually a user buyer. That's the individual that actually uses your product. Sometimes there's a technical buyer. These are folks that they can say no, but they can't say yes. And these folks usually say no because there's something related to regulatory or compliance that doesn't add up. It can also be IT related, so it doesn't integrate into existing systems. They are a technical buyer. And then there's your economic buyer. There's a person that signs the check. And the user buyer is really thinking about, does this solution make their job better? Does it make their job easier? Does it make their job more fun? That could be, more fun can be a value proposition for the user. And the technical buyer is thinking, does it meet specific standards, specifications? And the economic buyer is usually, in most cases, thinking, is this the right investment at the right time, given the opportunity cost? That's important to remember. The economic buyer is there to receive all value propositions from you, from your competitors, from everybody else. And you really have to convince them that this investment is better than every other investment that they have. And you actually don't know what those are investment opportunities, and you don't even know what those investment opportunities are. So you really need a value proposition for each buyer type in each of your target markets. And if you start to build this out and you get multiple value propositions in multiple markets, and yes, sometimes the buyer is the same individual. So the user buyer, the technical buyer, the economic buyer. But this is rare in healthcare unless you're developing a straight or direct to consumer product. And again, not knowing what you smart folks are working on, We at Alberta Innovates see very, very few Alberta innovations being developed as direct to consumer. There's a big market there. There's billions of dollars to be made. But I think what we see usually in Alberta is folks that are developing innovations that are meant to be sold into health. So I always try to just start again very simply with this value proposition template. And you can use this, you don't have to, it's up to you. But really, it has 4 components. And you're thinking about your value proposition as we believe that. So we believe that your target market will be able to do what? Why should they care? Give them something qualitative, give them something quantitative. I always recommend both. They will be able to do that by what? By your innovation, but give them a little bit of information about it for approximately some sort of investment. Folks know they have to give something to get something. And you should be thinking about today, even if you don't have a product, how much you think folks would be willing to pay for this. And remember, it's just a hypothesis. And you'll test that hypothesis by asking individuals, and you'll do it through market research, but you need to start there. I just made a hypothetical example up just so we can dive a little deeper into this. And so I apologize if Criticality is an actual company. I went through our portfolio and it's not, but there may be somebody out there by that exact name. This is not them. So this is hypothetical. Criticality is a med tech company. It's developed a medical device. That medical device is invasive. That's important. It's a sensor. It can measure 6 vital signs every second and can predict deterioration of patients in critical care. So it's got a few components here that are really important to think about. Critical care exists in the acute setting. There's nurses involved. There's business unit managers involved. This is invasive. It's got to be put in by that nurse. It's predictive. It's probably got to connect into existing IT systems. And so let's talk about, as an example, the 3 different users that you might have to sell to. So you need a value proposition user for the nurse. They play a significant role in critical care. And so you might say, you know, we believe that acute care centers, nurses specifically, will be able to reduce the complexities and possible errors associated with patient care by 50%. That's important. So that will be able to is really key for the nurse. Nurses, their jobs are pretty complex. They're critical care nurses, their jobs are pretty complex. Their job is to provide patient care. And what you're selling to them here is reducing errors associated with patient care by 50% and reducing the complexities to provide that patient care. And you're going to do that by helping them collect vital data, analyzing that data, and reporting critical care events before they happen. And if you ask any nurse, they would love to know that a critical care event is going to happen before it happens. And yeah, let them know how much it's going to cost, not because they're the buyer, but they can advocate on your behalf in terms of the cost for what you're going to get from a patient care perspective. And again, I just made this number up, $1 million a year or $5,000 per patient. Now, that's a very different value proposition to the nurse than you would give to your technical buyer, who would be IT or compliance. So same thing, we believe that acute care centers will be able to, and this is something that IT compliance will care about, enhance the data sharing and security capacity across departments. So one of the things that they care about is security, privacy, standardization across departments. Whenever you have people doing things, individual people doing things, even though you have a standard of care and you have a process that you follow, individuals will create their own interpretation of that. And they would love nothing more than to have standardization sharing and security across departments. And you're also going to tell them this is not through, like with the nurse, collecting the data, analyzing the data, and reporting the critical events. You're going to give them something technical. You're going to do it by integrating an ISO 9001. I don't know if that's the right ISO. I just threw it in there. It's a very common one. Regulatory approved, privacy compliant sensor technology that's already interoperable with existing care processes and IT systems. Because IT might say, we can't use that sensor because the software that it runs on is not interoperable, it's not compliant, it doesn't create the privacy that we need, and it doesn't work with our existing systems. Remember, most of your buyers, in most cases, 99% of the cases, are not going to overhaul their existing systems just for your innovation. And so these folks can say no if it does not work with what's already there. Critical care units are monitored by department heads. They're responsible for everything from scheduling to buying and maintaining equipment and supplies, and they care maybe about something a little bit different. So you might say, we believe that acute care centers will be able to redeploy or reduce nursing labor by 30% in the critical care department. And you're going to do this by automating data collection and prioritizing patient care. That's probably more important to a department head over and above everything when it comes to thinking about the innovation that you are offering. And so these are 3 different value propositions for 3 different individuals. But remember, they're just hypothetical. Think about those propositions. Think about the different buyers in your scenario and create value propositions for all of them and test those value propositions. I say I only have 11 minutes and I'm almost done. I want to talk quickly about customer discovery. So as I said, and I will continue to say this is just business strategy hypothesizing. And again, most of you are graduate students, you should be good at hypothesizing, but the really important piece is the customer discovery. And I want to be clear when I say customer discovery and versus selling, because you can get too caught up in trying to tell others why what you're doing is important and why they should think about buying. And so customer discovery is really about asking and listening, so asking good questions. And selling is about telling folks what they need and why they need it. So there's a nuance there, but it's different. And so when you're doing customer discovery, you really need to, again, understand who you're talking to, what is their position, what is their authority, what kind of buyer are they, you need to listen to them, you need to understand how their information fits into your hypothesis. And you need to check all of the things that you think are true. Product features, what do they care about? Value propositions, what do they care about from a value proposition perspective? What are the current models? What are the current technologies? What are the current care processes? How do you fit into that picture? And you're asking question after question after question because you're trying to gain some intelligence and some understanding, and you're trying to determine whether your hypothesis is true or false. And with customer discovery, this is really, really, really important. It's about turning hypotheses into facts. You got to validate, and every time you have a conversation, you're probably going to pivot. You're probably going to change how you state a value proposition. Maybe it's a single word, maybe it's the value proposition entirely. And you're going to do that over and over and over again until you feel like you've hit the nail on the head and you can actually get that customer. You can grab that customer, you can sell something to that customer. And only then are you truly building a business strategy and truly building a business is when you have customers. So that's, again, the most important piece to this. Again, I want to just reiterate, it is the #1 goal. It's acquiring customers. These aren't the only questions to ask. When we work with companies in health, we actually have a set of about, I think it's almost 50 questions that they should consider when doing their customer discovery and trying to validate their hypothesis. And one of the biggest challenges that we have sometimes is a lot of our innovators are clinicians. And so often they feel that they understand the market, they understand the pain points, they understand the value propositions, and they do to a large extent. But healthcare is delivered in different departments, in different jurisdictions, in different areas, in different ways. And it's not standardized. And so it's important to take and leverage your experience as a clinician and to use that and to continue to go out and talk to other clinicians in different places. So I'll just finish with this. I think it's a great Dilbert cartoon about customer discovery. And this, because this is Dilbert's boss, says, I love this feature. You guys nailed it. Dilbert says, cool. I guess you'll be our first customer. And his boss says, I said, I loved it. I never said I would buy it. And that's really, really important. And as you're doing this customer discovery, to make sure you're asking folks about their willingness to pay, thinking about how you are quantifying that and verifying that, because until you get a customer, everything you're doing is a hypothesis. So I'll stop there. I know that this was a lot of information in a very short period of time. I know some of it, again, as I said, may have been a bit of a reiteration of what some others have done, but I just wanted to kind of share that with you and help you think about it maybe in a different way.
Great, thank you so much, Rod. This is definitely challenging material for us. So hearing it again and hearing it in different ways is incredibly helpful for our students. So thank you so much for that. So I had a starting question, which is a bit of a complicated question. You alluded to the sort of rubric of who chooses, who pays, who uses, who decides. I don't know whether I had that quite right.
Yeah.
But there's a challenge here, right? In that you mentioned also the fact that we have, those different targets, if you like, the user target where we're going to be presenting the opportunity and look at the value. But then we've also got other players in that sequence. So question number one is that linear? In other words, in what order do you do it? So that if you don't get past A, you can't go to B? Or do you do them in parallel so that you can progress, even though one of them may be very challenging? And the related question is that, as you know, so many of the innovations in healthcare that occur in Alberta actually end up being adopted first in the United States. So when we start thinking about that, who chooses, who decides, who blah, blah, are we talking about Alberta Health Services, or are we talking about the Veterans Administration? So yeah. How do we effectively make sure that when we go through that process, we're going through it in the right context, because some of these contexts are dissonant?
Yeah, so I think the answer is all of this happens in parallel, and all of these pieces are kind of interchangeable and all impact each other. And I like to kind of liken it, because I do have a science background. It's like, injecting a cell with a molecule that's going to inhibit a protein. And as scientists, we know that that's going to cause this kind of cascading effect, and it's going to bring, it's going to create a positive impact on this signaling pathway and a negative one on this. And you have to start to think about your business in that way. It's not this static piece. It really is this amorphous, ever-moving piece that needs to pivot and needs to change and needs to be communicated in different ways. You might go to a meeting at 11 and talk about your technology, and a meeting at 11:30 and talk about your technology. And if I went to both meetings, I would think they were different technologies. It just matters who you're talking to. With regards to Alberta Health Services or Alberta Health and the market, so when you're in a public market, and I played with the idea of talking a little bit today about reimbursement pathways, but I think Jennifer might be chatting about that this afternoon, so I stayed away from it. But in Alberta, in a lot of public places, you really have to start to think about how will you be reimbursed for, or how will reimbursement happen within the context of your innovation. And not just reimbursement for you, how do you make money? It's how does the clinician code the activity so that they can receive the money from Alberta Health or Alberta Health Services that comes back into their pocket or into operations, or helps them build a budget to help support patients in this space. And so reimbursement pathways are really important, especially in Canada. That also goes to my comment around that ideal customer and getting even just down to the nitty gritty. The reimbursement pathway in Alberta will be different than the reimbursement pathway in Saskatchewan, and it will be different than the reimbursement pathway in Nova Scotia. That sucks, but some of these reimbursement pathways are easier to get through, and you have to start to familiarize yourself with them. There's a code book that's about 3,000 pages thick of reimbursement codes. That's how clinicians code the activity that they do. And if your innovation doesn't fit into one of those codes, it's going to be really hard to get them to use it. And even though it's 3,000 pages long, there's probably 90% of the activity is often coded under just 10% of those codes. And so to try to understand, and that's all public information, you can get it from the AMA, you can get it from Alberta Health, you can understand what the reimbursement pathway looks like. I hope that helps answer your question a little bit better.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, what it reinforces in my mind is that as someone who is developing that innovation and looking for those pathways, you have to be both resilient in finding barriers in many places but not being discouraged, while at the same time being open to pivoting to make sure that you do adjust to the realities. Because to go in there with the assumption that you can change the codes to make them fit your innovation is probably a step too far. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And as scientists, again, like, you need to test these hypotheses and don't worry about being wrong, because when you're in the lab and you're wrong, you just shift your hypothesis, right? And that's the same thing here, is you're just shifting your hypothesis over and over and over again. And think of it as always being a hypothesis until you have a sale. That only then has your hypothesis been realized. And so always be ready to make that shift. I think scientists, for what it's worth, I think researchers make excellent innovators and excellent entrepreneurs. I really do, because they have that mentality.
Raja, thank you so much. We're at time, and that was great. And I think really encouraging. Those last words were very important, because I think that especially this morning, our whole team has really received a lot of information and probably find it a little overwhelming, but they should rest assured that their training stands them in good stead to do this. And to have that put back into our comfort zone, I think is really very, very helpful. Thank you so much, Raja. And yeah, I hope the rest of your weekend is relaxing and fun, and I'm sure you'll be with your family. So thank you again for coming along.
Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.